everybody. This is still intimidating. Oh, geez. How do I get back? Gone too fast. There we go. So I had a little bit of panic. I thought Nikki was doing this purely as a panel. And then he said, oh no, turn up with a 20-minute presentation. So I scribbled some notes in a cab. And he said, focus on the early lessons of things you've learned in the Atlassian journey. And I figured that you probably don't want to hear about our journey again because you can read it online a number of different places. $10,000, 2 uni kids, it all got a little crazy, and here we are. So I thought instead I'd focus on the lessons that I keep learning. So these are lessons from 2004 that I probably relearned in 2006, probably relearned in 2008, kicked myself in the ass in 2010 for not learning the things that I really knew, and I probably did them this year as well. And they're really, really hard, and I'll try to put a story alongside each one and hopefully create a little bit of conversation for the questions. So the first one is, and if I have a small plug for somebody that I read every single day, there's a site called Stratechery. It's written by a guy called Ben Thompson out of Microsoft. It's probably the best $100 you will spend next to the sunrise ticket that you bought. It's truly amazing, and even just reading it as a, micro seed entrepreneur, you have one person on your team, it's you. I think you'll learn a lot. And he uses this term ladder up, and I think it's one of the lessons from the early days of Atlassian. We laddered up constantly, and we didn't even realize we were doing it. What he means by laddering up is you look at a lot of these businesses on day one, and you think that's not a really exciting business. So if you look at Atlassian, we started doing customer support for a third-party piece of software. It was a terrible business model. We learned a few things. We then turned that into a piece of software that became Jira. That was a bug tracker meant for software developers. That turned from a software developer bug tracker into a broader issue tracker that's taken Jira from software teams into from software teams fixing problems to software teams planning their work to IT teams all over the place. And now finance teams and HR teams and marketing in general sort of work management platform, right? We didn't set out to create a work management platform in Jira. Along the way, we've added multiple applications and we've kept going. And so what he would term is ladder up. And I think it's important for founders to understand because quite often you look at something and people go, oh, that's not going to work. And you're like, okay, but what can they learn from that? And where can they take that and go on to something else and something else, right? So lots of famous examples. Netflix is a good one. They started with a relatively good idea on DVDs. They laddered that up into streaming because they saw what was going to happen. They've laddered that up into their own content, and they've kind of pivoted 3 or 4 times, if you want to think about it that way, into a bigger and bigger business that obviously dwarfs where they started. And a part of that laddering up, I think, is about never stop being ambitious. So we have always believed in the blue ocean around Atlassian. We've always been very practical about what is the next island we're trying to get to kind of thing and had a 1 or a 3 year goal that was achievable, but at the same time, the belief in the long term is very large. I like to tell people at work at the moment that we're a big startup. We've got some weapons on our side. We've got $1 billion in the bank. We've got 1,000 amazing engineers. We've got 50,000 awesome customers. So if you use those as your startup recipe, forget the products that we have today, what could we go build tomorrow, right? And then people look at you crazily and say, what do you mean? Haven't we done a lot? And I think it's part of laddering up for me personally. So I would encourage all entrepreneurs, don't stop. Secondly, all technology is made by people. Oops. My phone is reading to me. There we go. Sorry. So what I mean, all technology is made by people, another one of my favorite phrases. People assume that technology companies are all about code, and they're all about software, services, sites, apps, whatever it is. All of those things are fundamentally made by people. And to be honest, all of Atlassian's problems, all of, I assume, every startup's problems are largely people related. So when you kind of walk back to the root cause, it's not about the technology you chose or how you wrote your app or whatever. It's the people. It's the people that wrote the app or something else went wrong. And when I talk about this with Atlassian is that the talent bar can just never drop. It doesn't matter how big you are. It doesn't matter whether you're 5 people and then you're 50 people and then you're 500 people. As soon as that talent bar starts to drop, it's the start of the end, right? And how do you do that? Well, the number one way is to hire slowly. So we've made plenty of mistakes in our time about hiring too fast, and it's an incredibly difficult lesson for founders, you're struggling, you've got some money in the door, you've got to go, the gun goes off, you start sprinting like mad, and you go, geez, I've got these 3 holes, I've got to find somebody good at this person will do, and you stick them in the hole, and then boom, you've committed the first fatal sin, right? Make sure that every single person you add is awesome, grows the team, etc. And the second part of that is as soon as you realize somebody's not fitting in for whatever reason, do something about it today, right? Go back, if there's one lesson I can say is go back to you. How many entrepreneurs in the room feel there's at least one person in their team that they've got a gut feeling might not be the right person? Yep, okay, so there's about 30% of the room's honest. Do something about it today. If there's a single lesson that I would take away, that we have taken far too long to realize square pegs in round holes, etc. The best founders I've ever met have great people judgment. Even so, they all struggle to take action on that people judgment, right? It's the hardest thing you will possibly have to do, letting people go or having tough conversations with them or whatever it is. But when you think that all technology is made by people, whether you've got 5 people or 5,000 doesn't make a difference. You've got to have the right people on the boat. And it is the toughest thing that you will ever have to do as an entrepreneur. I guarantee you that. The rest is easy if you can nail that. Third lesson from our journey, I think that's really important, is about understanding the Pacific Ocean. So we sit here in Sydney. I spend probably, a quarter of my life in San Francisco. And it took me a long time to understand this. Famously, we started here. We had about 1,000 customers, 1,500 odd customers in the States, and we had no presence at all. And we went to New York. A lot of people telling us we should be in the US. It'll make a difference. We went to New York. It worked pretty well somewhat, not other ways, right? But we learned a lot of lessons along the way. It didn't work so well because at the time, New York wasn't a great tech community for us. We had a lot of customers there, which was great to go visit them, but then they just emailed us afterwards, so there's no point being down the road. So we moved across to San Francisco, and we've been in San Francisco, for reference, from about 2006, October 05, I think. So call it 10 years, 10 and change. And one of the things I've noticed is that one of the advantages Australian startups can have is to understand what they gain by being in Australia, but at the same time, you have to understand what you're missing by not being in the Valley and try to get the best of both worlds, right? People over there aren't smarter, they're not taller, they're not, somehow these magical breeds of people that just smash everything that we do. Not true. They do have a lot more networks around them, and they do have a lot more experience. And that's the hardest thing to fight against, right? But sometimes experience leads you down the wrong paths. If you look at Atlassian's model, or if you look at the various things we've done that were counterintuitive, experienced people wouldn't have gone down that path, right? And so sometimes that's a benefit, and sometimes it holds you back. I had a customer from a large unnamed Australian bank who, in about 2007, sat me down, and I was talking in a meeting about some of our stuff and how good it was, and trying to, generally sell without sales stuff that we were doing that was really good. And he said, mate, he stopped me and he said, I'm not trying to be Facebook. And it hit me like a ton of bricks, right? This bank, he's like, I'm not trying to be Facebook. You're talking about all this stuff that they're doing. It's wonderful. But my team's here. They're sort of up here. My team's here. I'm trying to get from here to here. I've got practical real-world problems. Are you going to help me solve my real-world problems, or are you going to tell me about what Facebook does? Because I'm not getting there. You know what I mean? It was kind of this realization that we can learn so much from what people do up there, but at the same time, we have these wonderful real customer problems to go solve and real businesses to build. And I would say one of Atlassian's big advantages is we straddle the Pacific Ocean. We've got a foot in both camps. So we have generally a lot more marketing, kind of outbound DNA in San Francisco and in the South Bay and in Austin. And then we have a lot more, engineering DNA here. Increasingly, that's mixing on both sides. And when you look at why that is, we get some of the excitement, the creativity, the amazing people who are just constantly trying to my first point about, tackling blue oceans. Geez, you meet everybody in every bar there, and they're trying to solve some worldwide massive problem. And you go meet the same Australian entrepreneur, and he's like, well, I've got this small idea that I think would be this, and the same business, it's just the way they view the world is different. You can learn from that. At the same time, sometimes that all ends up in froth and bubbles, and we do tend in Australia to build more realistic, more practical businesses. So I think what you can take from that is to understand, if you haven't been over there and you are an entrepreneur, go over, try to immerse yourself, try to understand it, try to kind of figure out the system and what's going on, and then come back and kind of build your business and try to work out a rhythm. Each business will be different, of being there and being here, and how the two sides work, work together. Fourth one I would say is that values and culture matter, and they matter from day one, right? As I said, remember how, and I did honestly write these slides in the cabin and sitting outside with a coffee. Remember how I said all technology is made by people? People are unable to be captured, right? You can't keep your people. How do they stay? How do they buy into the dream, the vision? Whatever it is that you're going out to do, right? How do you get them to buy in? It's the values, it's the culture of the organization. It's the reason people choose to stay somewhere. It's the reason they buy into the mission, right? It's the reason they'll give that extra 5 or 10% to really make something special. And if you've got everybody giving that extra 5 or 10%, even just thinking time or whatever it is, or caring, right? They might even not even put a single extra minute, but they care that much more about trying to achieve the mission. They care about their colleagues. You build a real team, you build a network. And it's super important. And I see people putting this off. You can't put it off. It's happening, whether you like it or not. We were lucky enough to have pretty solid, I think, Australian founder values at the start. You can read our values online. There's sort of been written about a bit now, but the important thing about them, I always say, is one, they're not aspirational. At no point did we sit down and say, what do we want to be? We sat down and said, what are we that we don't want to lose, right? I think our values were codified in probably 04 or 05. So we're 3 years into the business at the time, and writing down what it was that we didn't want to lose about what we already were was a lot easier than trying to be something else. Because I give you a hint, if you write down what you're trying to be, you just won't be there, right? And you can find all sorts of presentations of Enron's values and all these great companies that failed in a big heap and had wonderful value statements, right? So you've got to live them. And the other thing is culture is really important, right? Lots of ways to define culture. I sometimes say culture is what happens when the boss is away, spend a lot of time traveling. If I'm not around, what goes on, right? It's like parents. You have parents, you've got kids. When you're not around, how do the kids behave? If they somehow behave differently, then it's a problem, right? If they behave the same way that you would expect them to behave, that's great. You've got a good culture going on. So think about the same way in your organisation, right? Find different ways to assess that. Look at the health of it. Look how well it's doing. You can't create it. You can hire people that support it, that are more of something or less of something, and they move on. The other thing I would say about culture that I've learned, especially in the last few years, do a lot more investing and spend a lot of time with a lot of different companies. There's no one company culture. It's not like we're all striving for the same thing. They're unique strands. They're like people. Companies have different personalities, different traits. And it's important to understand your own culture and work out if it is right for the mission you're trying to achieve or the people you have, or attracting the right people to go forward, obviously. But I've been an investor and on the board of another large Australian technology company called Tyro for about 6 years, and it has a very different culture to Atlassian. At first I was a bit confused by that, and now, having spent 6 years and knowing a lot of the guys and the founders really intimately, it's a great culture. It's a very different culture to what we have at Atlassian, but it's not wrong, right? They're on a different mission, different competitor set, different market, everything, and they've grown up a fundamentally different business, but it's still a great business, and so I think it's really important to understand that. And lastly, if there's a good lesson that I think is the most precious commodity you have as a founder is not money, it's time. And far too many people move far too slowly, especially in Australia. There's a lot of ways to think about this. It's doubly so in a startup because you have even less time than a big business. You can think about it just generally in life, right? If you calculate how many minutes you're going to spend with your kids. I heard something the other day that when your kids leave home at 18, you've spent 99% of the time you're likely to spend with them. It's pretty scary if you think about it. You're like, wow, I'm going to suddenly change that equation. It's like probably pretty hard to change, but you can change it now. Or at least my kids are 1, 3, and 5, so I can change some of that now. When I say making faster decisions, the lesson from Atlassian's history is we a whole bunch of times spent a lot of time agonizing over something back and forth. And we've gotten better over time, I believe, as an organization at making faster decisions. Lots of different tech companies you'll find have some sort of a slogan like this. So if you look at LinkedIn, for example, I believe they have a system, 5-day decisions or something, which is basically if 2 people can't make a decision in 5 days, they escalate it to somebody else, usually a boss or one of the bosses. If they can't make a decision, it goes up again. Now what happens there is it forces people to think no decision should take longer than 5 days. Nobody wants to escalate a decision to their boss, and their boss goes, well, this is obvious, we just go left. What's wrong with you people? So that decision doesn't get escalated. And the flip side is the ones that do go up are usually the gnarly, really hard problems, right? Where someone's like, oh, geez, that is a tough problem. I see why you guys are struggling with that. Thanks for escalating it to me. It does the right ability of driving both. Facebook obviously has move fast and break things. Amazon has a similar slogan. I think it's around, I couldn't find it online in the cab, but it's something to do with one-way and two-way doors. So Bezos is always famous as saying something like, if it's a two-way door, just charge through it, basically. If you can make a decision and if it doesn't work, turn around and go back through the door, you should move that thing immediately. You don't need to escalate it, go, 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 go kind of thing, right? Move as fast as you can. If it's a one-way door, a type of decision that's hard to reverse, okay, take a little more time and be thoughtful, but it's a good framework for putting things in place. One of the things that Scott and I used to talk about in the early days of Atlassian was, let's get it 80% correct and move forward. Right? And I think it's a really valuable life lesson I use in all sorts of circumstances now is you don't need to be 100% correct in every single decision. It's actually probably a negative thing to be 100% correct. It probably means you've spent way too much time, right? Get a couple of signals, make a good gut call. If you get your gut calls 80% correct, but you're moving forward constantly, you're going to be in motion, right? And single critical thing about startups and technology companies is speed is the single ingredient that makes you win at the end of the day. And what else did I want to say? That's my 20 minutes. Threw this in the end because I love this illustration that one of our designers did. I think the other thing that's important is to remember that it's about people and you're supposed to be having fun and learning. I love the last part of one of the last presentations that I saw through the wings here around constantly learning, right? Yes, you may fail and people talk about the failure culture in the Valley and how they fail 2-3 times and then succeed. I would say they've learned a whole lot for that third occasion, right? We've been very lucky. I had 1 or 2 early failures with Nikki, I see him in the wings, right? But we learned a ton in those early journeys that we did go and apply, and since then we've made 80% correct calls. But if you're not having a good time, don't do it. Go do something else, right? Life is too short, so enjoy it and keep learning.
Wonderful, and thank you. I actually wanted to spend most of my questions talking about humans, so thank you for writing those slides. Go back to the very early years of Atlassian and how to hire great people, obviously is correct at a high level, really go down to that specific context of you have very little money, you don't have very many qualifications as to be a hiring manager or to be a great picker of people. Explain what you would tell yourself 10 or 12 years ago about making the correct hiring decisions in those first 5 hires.
Sure. What did we used to do in the early days? A couple of things. We used to have a thing called the beer test. It's not at all what it sounds like. It was basically a simple question we would ask ourselves. It doesn't have to be beer, it could be a cup of tea. Is this a person that I would find if I was stuck in a bar with, I could have a good conversation about something? I don't really care if you're into 18th century French poetry or, functional programming or anything, but are you the sort of person that I'm going to sit in a bar for a couple of hours and be like, oh wow, I learned a bunch of stuff, that was really interesting, and I can have a conversation and so, because it seemed to us to be a very easy sort of sniff test, and you meet people and you're like, he seemed great, but I'm just not really sure. It's like, nope. If you're like, man, I want to spend more time with that person, great, done, right? I learned a whole bunch of stuff. We had some guy in the early days who was, I think he was like the Doom or Quake champion of Australia or something, and we talked about that for an hour, and I remember he left and I was like, I didn't really learn anything about his skills, but he seemed interesting. We tried to do a lot in the early days of testing on hiring as well, in terms of give us some code samples. We didn't know how to hire anywhere near as sophisticatedly as we do today. So we'd just ask them to do something, right? And you're amazed how few people ask. It's like you're hiring somebody for a press position, right? Write me a press release about X and just see what they write. You know what I mean? So few job interviews actually do anything functional like that. I'm trying to think if there's anything else. We used to do both of those.
What were the sources of error? Where did you make most of your hiring mistakes? What kind of backgrounds of people did you think would work out that did not work out?
I don't know there's a single thread. We certainly made a few cultural errors, people who just didn't fit in with the team for whatever reason. We've also talked in the past a fair bit around getting... We sometimes have a struggle with getting the varnish off people. I feel like one of the things the corporate world does is put this kind of varnish and polish on people that they come across and you're like, wow, that seemed really smart, but I didn't actually learn anything. But the presentation was, you're sort of a polish to people. And in the startup world, you kind of got to sand all that polish off, right? It's about raw wood and are you getting shit done or not and those type of things. Some people find it really hard to adjust from the corporate world to be de-varnished, but other people thrive. I don't think I would say we've got a great recipe of doing that continually, but we're trying to learn, I suppose. Culture fit, that's the other thing. Again, as I said, if I look back at certainly the first 4, 5, 6 people that we had to let go, we had no idea what we were doing. We did it terribly wrongly. We've learned way better, etc. We have harder conversations early that I could spend a whole hour on that. But I think we did have a gut feel that there was something wrong, right? And even then, I was just in a review the other week about something, and we're much more retrospective nowadays. When you went back to this particular person's interview transcripts, there was a bunch of yellow flags and red flags that we should have listened to way earlier, and this is in 2016. And I think if we'd had that in the early days, we would have probably gone, oh, yeah, I think we should hire them, but... And then 6 months later gone, oh, that but was just way too big, we should have listened to ourselves. So call it gut feel.
What about the sources of underestimation or overestimation? So, as you get bigger and bigger, you can convince people from Dropbox or Facebook or Google to come and join you. How have you found hiring, that glittering resume versus talk also about the backgrounds of people that are the opposite of that and have worked out tremendously well?
Yeah, I think there's certainly a temptation to think if someone comes from Google or Facebook, they're just amazing. And there are some amazing people at those firms, and there's a lot of good people. And, the systems around some of those firms are so sophisticated. Again, you cannot build a firm that relies on amazing people. Like from a stop-go of you need it 100% 10x engineers, I'll tell you stuff from the start, right? So you need all those different ladders of people. The hard part is to weed out, are they actually that 10x engineer from Facebook, or did they just do a pretty good job, had a great Facebook system around them, lots of smart people around them, and hence they kind of went on. We've had that for a few cases from some bigger technology firms. A good question we tend to ask is, tell me about the last few people you hired, and then I drill in and I drill in and I drill in. You find sometimes, for example, in these big firms, people have never actually hired anybody. What they said is, I need to build a team of 5 people, and HR rolls in with 5 people, and they go, oh, that's okay, I'm not sure about that guy, okay, great. And then they, like, well, did you go to LinkedIn? No, someone provided, did you interview them? Well, I sort of did, but like really. So I think that's the case. At the same time, we've hired a lot of really scrappy people. I'm a big fan that you don't necessarily need a degree. It's weird, I'm an adjunct professor of computer science at UNSW, so I believe in degrees in university and those type of things in education, but a lot of our great early hires either had completely random degrees in philosophy or something completely unrelated to computer science, or no degrees at all, right? And we've had a number of struggles. I'll give you the example, bringing people into the country that don't have degrees. It's so hard to import people who don't have a degree, and I'm like, I'm buying this person's company, they have 10 people that work for them, they've been really successful. Oh, sorry, they don't have a bachelor's degree, you can't bring them in. So don't be snowed by either of those. Test them, get them to do real functional, practical, down-to-earth stuff, and if it's too down-to-earth for them, they're probably too polished.
You've heard me say this before, but all of the world's most valuable companies were started by deeply unqualified people who had just finished university or hadn't finished university, in the case of Facebook and Microsoft and so on. How did you learn how to become a great CEO? And then who are the people, what are the things that have helped you the most in that journey?
Still figuring that out, to be honest. I agree with the assertion of the question, I have to say. I do think if you look at history, there's 2 things. 1, they're generally unqualified, and 2, they generally come in pairs. So even those great companies where you look at that, you think of a single founder, there's usually actually a co-founder behind the scenes. So that's a super valuable lesson, I suppose. I don't know, I think we read a lot. I think we thought a lot. I think we went back to first principles. We're big on first principles, which sometimes causes us pain, right? Atlassian has run through a lot of brick walls that we didn't necessarily need to run through, but because we felt to learn everything from first principles was the way to do things, we sort of hit every single brick wall along the way. And there's some sort of cosmic hope that makes us stronger in the long term. But I think that, asking why, it's not that you learn to copy somebody else. It's like, why is this happening? Why does this work this way? Whether it's an HR process or a technical process, you've got to read an awful lot, constantly be learning. I think that's what great CEOs do. I think I'm always a big fan, you should not be afraid of the imposter syndrome. Neil Gaiman gives a great talk on make good art, I think is his talk. And he has this impression that someday someone's going to turn up with a clipboard, knock on his door and say, mate, I realise you've been faking it all these years kind of thing. And he goes, shit, you caught me, I have, right? And I constantly feel like someone's going to turn up with a clipboard and go, you're just having us on. And I think the weirdest thing is the more great entrepreneurs I meet from around the world, they all have exactly the same feeling, right? It doesn't matter how big their company is, how many people they are, how many times they've been successful. They still feel like they're a little bit of an imposter. They haven't kind of figured it out. And to be honest, I think that probably drives them to learn a lot more, to fact check, to go to first principles. If you think about what that drives you to do in a positive way, in a negative way, you'd think, oh, I'm not qualified to be here, I'm going to fuck off, right? But in a positive way, you're like, geez, I'm totally out of my depth. How do I deal with that problem? Okay, well, I'm going to really understand from first principles. I'm going to try to learn as much as I can. I'm going to realize that stuff gets hard. Another good random lesson that I wrote in my notes in the cab. If you think about a firm growing at 40% a year, hopefully a lot of the small startups are growing a lot more than 40% a year, right? If your company is growing 40% a year, every single job is doubling in 2 years, which is pretty scary. So that's no promotion. Your job doubled in the last 2 years. That's a pace of learning that is very hard for most people to adapt to, right? If you're getting promoted, as in you're the CEO of a company that's growing, so the entire pyramid is kind of growing as well, it's a lot more than doubling every 2 years. So if your pace of learning isn't kind of keeping up with that and stretching, then you're in big trouble.
Talk about, because you came at it fresh out of university, explain sort of the benefits of naivety or being ignorant. How's that worked for you over the years? What things did you avoid, or what company did you build that was different? Yeah,
our model kind of came, again, it's the first principles thing and it's the naivety thing, right? I think a lot of great tech companies are made from naivety in terms of you don't understand how something should be done, so you kind of figure out the best way to do it. And quite often, whatever thing it was being done by everybody else in a different way, and you look like a genius, and you think, well, actually, I just kind of sat there and thought about it. Or, in our case, our model has evolved, so we have a very friction-free, sort of high-velocity model. We sell enterprise software, which traditionally is, big salespeople and multi-million-dollar deals and all this, and we sell them sort of knock a couple of zeros off the price and sell it through the web and try to scale out, worldwide, right? We have customers in about 160-odd countries now. We sort of knew that had to be the case from Australia. I'd say we had a gut feel about having to be global, right? If we're going to have a lot of customers, we're always ambitious. We wanted to build a big business. We weren't quite sure how to do that. Well, we've got to have a lot of customers. If we just have customers in Sydney, it's probably not going to be a big business. So, okay, it had to be global. You think, well, how can I get to people? Okay, I'm going to hire salespeople all over the world. Well, I don't have any money, so it's probably not a good plan. What's plan B? Well, we'll stick it up on the internet and see if anyone downloads it, right? And people did. And we had to tweak and a lot of changes and learning along the way. But some of that came from force, which I think is some of the things that Australian companies do well, is we have a weirdly constrained environment. And constraints do make, for sometimes the best solutions. Unconstrained solutions are very hard. One of the things I worry about at Atlassian now is we have a huge amount of resources. And so people throw a huge amount of resources at problems, naturally. You're like, wait a second, we used to solve this with 5 people. Why do we now need 50? And it's not always the case, right? So sometimes the constraints of a startup are really good. And then going back to that first principles and really thinking about it. And at the same time, making fast decisions, right? There was a bunch of stuff we tried. It failed miserably. We were throw it in the bin, go again, right? Try again. Admitting that it wasn't working really, really fast. Throwing it out, trying over. maybe that's naivety, right? We would have thought, oh, geez, this is the way everyone else does it. Try again.
What have outside people been most wrong about at Atlassian? What is the canned advice that has been sort of wrong time and time again as you've grown?
Well, the obvious one. I'll give you an obvious one and a non-obvious one. The obvious one that's wrong about Atlassian is we need to hire salespeople to continue to grow. I mean, we had that literally from 500 grand in sales. To get to $1 million, you're going to need to hire some salespeople. And your model's really nice at the moment, but when real companies start picking it up and whatever else, yada, yada, yada. And again, I think it's really important to understand, maybe this is a good lesson about the naivety, is we took that advice and didn't say, you guys are idiots, we know better. We took that advice and said, okay, it's interesting. You're a very smart person, you have a lot of history and experience, and this advice is framed by all of that history, and that's why you're giving me this piece of advice, right? And it's correct in your world. It seems incorrect in my world, but I can still probably learn something from it if I think about that advice and go, well, what is it that I think has changed in the fundamental rules of the game or something? And so we were lucky enough, and I will use that phrase carefully, we were lucky enough to get a little bit of early traction that every time someone would give us that advice, we would say, well, it seems to be working okay. Maybe this person's right, but let's just try it for another couple of months, you know what I mean? And then it would work a bit better. And eventually we just like, nope, I'm pretty sure they're wrong. I'm pretty sure we're onto something that no one else has figured out. But it was a lot of learning, right? There was years and years and years of learning in there. And every time we're like, really, geez, this is a really smart person. And so that has been continually the case. It's still the case now. People say we need to hire a bunch of salespeople to get to $1 billion in sales. So we'll see. I don't believe so at the same time. The second thing that people get wrong about Atlassian and advice is we are sort of non-conformist on approach. Like we try to be different. We just want to do everything differently, right? And we do a lot of things differently. But actually, I think we probably do 5% of things differently. 95% of stuff we do pretty much the same way every well-run, efficient corporation tries to do it. And it's, again, assessing every decision and choosing the 5% that you want to do differently. It doesn't have to be a huge delta to somebody else to make a massive delta in the end corporation and the output, whatever you're measuring, widgets or profitability, whatever you want to measure. But a lot of people feel like we just try to be different for the sake of being different, and I really feel like we don't. We go back to first principles, and the few things we've chosen to do differently have been for a conscious reason and have been tested. And we do go back and retest things. This is another great example for your startup. We are constant testers and evaluators, very metric-driven, of things that we do. I was talking at dinner about one way we test stuff, which is turn it off. So I was talking to a great founder last night, and he was telling me about this wonderful email they send out to their staff. And I said, great, turn it off for a week. And it was kind of like, what the fuck? I'm like, turn it off for a week. If nobody complains, it's not a wonderful email. Right? And we do all sorts of stuff like that. Turn it off for a week, see what happens. We couldn't, for the life of us, figure out if our Google ads were working. This is about 2008. And I said, let's turn them off for a month. And everyone's like, wait a second. And we fought and fought. And eventually we just fucking turned them off for a month. Guess what? Traffic went down. We're like, shit, we don't know how they're working, but turn them back on again, right? And we could assess 20% of our traffic or whatever it was came from Google ads, right? But for all the metrics, it was like easy just to turn it off for a couple of weeks and it became obvious. And if we turned it off and we couldn't detect any downstream effect, we were like, well, maybe it's not working. We're just spending money for nothing. And so we are constantly testing and changing things, dropping false statements or crazy statements into emails that go out to staff and see if they read. If you send out a bunch of communication, you have a bunch of meetings, right? Tell them that, this team XYZ has decided that this project management tool is great. They decided they're going to go into space exploration and put polar bears on Mars because they need to cool down the planet and polar bears are the way it's going to do. If nobody mentions it, I guarantee you nobody read that email. Right? And so testing everything we do. We've tried the human-powered thing lots and lots and lots of times. Classic example of the way that we think. We automatically sell through the web. We have webinars. We tested an experience, this is probably in 2009, where we ran webinars with humans. And guess what? The webinars with humans outperformed the non-humans. So if I sat there and said, turn up at 11 o'clock Pacific time and I'll walk you through this demo for 40 minutes, and then I'll answer your questions and it's an hour and whatever else. But we had 100 people turn up, 50 people turn up. And so rather than saying, aha, the humans have won, let's just do a lot of webinars and hire a ton of people to go and do webinars, we tried to work out why did the humans win and do it again and again and again. And what we worked out is if we recorded somebody doing a webinar, didn't even need to put any questions at the end or even pre-can the questions. I believe we've tried both, I can't remember. And then just put it on. We could say, whatever time zone you're on, it's at 11 o'clock tomorrow morning. And people somehow feel that they're, oh, okay, it's 11 o'clock, it must be real. It doesn't say anywhere that it's a real webinar. It doesn't have to, it's a video. But I can run that 24 hours a day at 11 a.m. because it doesn't matter where you are. I run it at 11 a.m. tomorrow and you turn up and guess what? You performed way better. And I can now run 24 webinar videos a day, and they'll perform better than all the human people I could hire around the world. So again, that experimentation to see A versus B, and then why did B work? What can we do to improve A? I think it's important. I've totally lost track of the question.
It's a good answer. I'll ask one question before we go into the audience Q&A. You talked about laddering up and this idea of ambition growing over time. Is it simply, as you go on the journey, the field of view gets longer and longer, you can see the horizon? Or is it these sources of inspiration that are almost like, new founding moments of a company? Is it just a journey and everything becomes clear once you start walking? Or is it you discover these moments and then make a decision to really double down?
It's a great question. I think it's probably a bit of both, actually. I've always been a fan of the analogy that's very hard to see around corners. So I think about city blocks, right? You sort of walk a block, and you've got buildings on each side, and you can see some way in front of you, kind of probably a fair distance, but it gets narrower, perspective's very hard to see. When you reach the end of a block, you can suddenly see around both corners that you couldn't see beforehand. So you suddenly have some perspective in the world. Your business has achieved a position, your perspective with customers or with the products or the market or the landscape is different. But you had to walk that block. You had to try something, do something to get to a position where you could change your perspective, that you can then see both ways. And you can choose at that point to turn left or right or walk another block. And if your business is not making those choices, you'll just continue to head down that street as far as you go. Think of New York City, right? You're just going to keep going all the way across Manhattan. Now, it turns out that you might have looked left and seen a huge pot of gold over there and gone, geez, if I'd looked left, I might have seen this pot of gold because I have this perspective that nobody else has because I can suddenly see the cross street or whatever, right? So it's certainly that as you go forward, you have to do two things. One is constantly be assessing and looking around. You can't do it at every step, right? Sort of have to build into some sort of a rhythm of your business. It's hard to give it, a concrete nature. The second thing is, so you have to be looking. You have to have a business culture that's looking to the second part of your question. But at the same time, yes, your perspective does materially change. And I would say any founder that tells you they had this sort of 10-year plan, it's bullshit, right? Having sat with all sorts of different great founders of amazing companies, they almost all tell the same story, which is, well, I kind of had this small idea and we did it and people loved it or it worked. And then I thought, well, hang on a second. What we've really done, what I thought we were doing was this, and what we've really done is this, and I've sort of got the tail of an elephant now, and I start, pulling on it or whatever, doing something, and I've got a whole elephant, right? But I didn't realize what I had. I thought I had a hare, and I realized that hare was attached to an elephant. I'm like, whoa, geez, this is a lot bigger, but I have to kind of go down that journey. And then some people get the elephant and go, geez, hang on a second. I look around and I'm in the middle of are we in a zoo? And then they realize I've got a whole zoo, right? And so I think that's what laddering up is. The best businesses go through that path continually. And culturally, it's really hard because it can't be just founders that do it, right? You reach a stage like we're at, our whole business has to be innovating, right? And we also have a very core philosophy. If you look at the number of technology companies that made it through a decade, it's very small. And usually that's because once a decade, we have some massive technological shift to mobile, to the internet, to client server, whatever it was, right? If you look back in history, it's some shift roughly every 10 years. And most businesses take advantage of that shift. The new ones are created, old ones sort of fail. Very few make it through two of those shifts. And if you look at the ones that did, they're constantly reinventing themselves. They're constantly challenging themselves. They're constantly trying to build new things. One of our public company investors, who's awesome, gave a great analogy to me, which we had probably been doing, is like, I'm not interested in businesses that are about extraction of money. I'm about businesses that are about planting seeds and harvesting money. And it's a very different thing, right? Because your business has to be constantly creating products, creating value. And that means you're starting with zero value and then you've got 10 units of value over here and you've got to start planting that next 1 unit of value. And if your business is doing that, you're going to have a long journey. If you see the 10 units of value and goes, geez, I could do this and this and this and turn this 10 into 20 and this 20 into 40, it's unlikely that you're going to be successful, because eventually you're going to be extracting so much value from this set of customers that people go, well, I could do that cheaper or better, and that's when you sort of, it all falls over, right? Swiss cheese, you build a house, but it's actually lots of honeycombs inside and it all falls down. And so it can be very, very hard in the heat of battle to actually determine which of those two you're doing. And you need to be very clear, am I creating new value? Is my business creating enough stuff? That's probably in the second generation, once you've been somewhat successful at something. Make sure.
Wonderful. We talked about in earlier sessions about how to connect into Silicon Valley. How did you start learning from the best? How did you meet people? What did you find useful when you went to San Francisco and learned?
Trying to think. So when we turned up in 2005, we got pretty lucky with a few early connections that sort of put us onto people and hiring. Obviously, you know, the Aussie sort of connections, there was a bunch of us in that sort of 05, 06, 07 period. So for a while there, I was doing 2 weeks in Sydney and 2 weeks in San Francisco. So kind of literally moving every second Sunday. And so I spent a lot of time there and built up a pretty good network. Started certainly with a lot of Australians that came out of the woodwork and said, hey, I'm Australian too. And neither of us had any idea what we were doing, but at least there was two of us. And then other than that, turn up to everything. Now, people are pretty open. You have to develop a good bullshit detector. I think Australians probably have a pretty good bullshit detector. There's a lot of BS. Every company you meet, if I extracted the name and everything, I'd think, wow, this must be amazing. Like you hear the pitch in a bar and you're like, oh, dude, it's like you guys are amazing. And you go meet them in their office and like, where's everybody else? Oh, it's actually just the two of us. And we're kind of just getting started and here's a prototype of our app. But like, that's what we want to do. And you're like, oh, okay. Ooh. I believe that you were, 500 people. So I don't think there's any secret sauce to it. Get out and hustle. That's a big part of the entrepreneur's job, right?
Would you ever consider basing Atlassian in America rather than Australia?
We've thought about it a lot, sure. I don't really know what it means for us anymore. It's kind of a moot point. We have, biggest office is Sydney by far, but then we have big offices in San Francisco, Menlo Park, Austin, Amsterdam. So, if the ratio mix is constantly changing and shifting anyway,
Maybe as a follow-up to that, like we've talked about the good parts of San Francisco, what are the bad parts of hiring and the bad parts of being there?
It is very, very, very hard to hire. If you think you have trouble hiring engineers here, good luck over there. It is very, very hard to raise money. Much as people think it rains down from the sky, I consistently stick to my point of view that if you have a good business, and don't forget if you have a shit business, it's going to be hard everywhere. If you have a good business, team, etc., it's easier to raise money in Sydney than it is in San Francisco. That's my core belief, that it is so hard to raise money over there. You may have a 99th percentile idea. Here there are 10 99th percentile ideas. There are 1,000. So the competition, even at that level, is just so much harder that, networks and everything else, you're pushing shit up a hill. Hiring people is very, very difficult. There is a lot more churn than we have in Sydney. Again, we get great employee loyalty here. People feel like they're building something. There's a story. It's a little bit more mercenary in the Valley. That's not to denigrate an entire nation, but like you see that the turnover time of employees is just higher, right? It's a lot more attractive stuff. You're sitting at Atlassian in San Francisco and you're like, oh, geez, I go with Facebook, Dropbox, like all these people around, like they're getting hit up all the time, constantly. I don't know if anybody watches Silicon Valley, but there was an episode just recently where one of the guys left and he's getting all this shit delivered to his house by recruiters. And it's like, haha, it's really funny, except that it's just kind of real. And that's a good example here. If you're an engineer here sitting around, it's not like anyone's going to send you stuff, whereas there, you're like just getting inundated. So hiring is a lot harder. Standing out is a lot harder. Standing out in all the bullshit and all the press and all the other things. The other one is I think sometimes people try so hard in San Francisco to stand out, they don't spend enough time actually building a real business. It's like such a smoke and mirrors kind of facade, and they're great at raising money, they're great at marketing their business, but they're not great at building anything of substance, and they get caught up in all that kind of froth and bubbles, and they forget to build something with a real problem.
Go into detail about your choice to build a second product early on in the life of Atlassian and balancing that against the standard advice of you should stick to one thing and do it well.
Sure. Get asked this a lot, and to be honest, It feels like we should have put a lot more time into it at the time than we did. We had, to take you back, so we had about probably 10 people. Jira was going pretty well. It's probably 2004. Two years into the business, I guess, around 10 to 20 people. Customers, list of requests a mile long, and we decided to start a second product that became Confluence. And a lot of the internal questioning was, hang on a second, we've got 1,000 things to do. Why are we adding something else, right? And our gut feel, which turned out to be right, is we were adding another rocket to the engine, right? If you've got two rockets that are going by themselves, and have some shared core of some kind, the entire vehicle moves a lot quicker, right? So yes, we're going to have 1,000 things to do in Jira. Guess what? 2016, 15 years later, we still have 1,000 things to do in Jira, right? That's never going to get shorter, but somehow learning when to fork out into a second product. It doesn't have to be a whole second product like we did, right? It can be a new feature line. Your customers are always going to ask for a million things in whatever it is that you've already given them. You're trying to start an enterprise product, they're going to say, why are you wasting time over there? You should be doing this thing that I already have and making it better, right? And that's going to be constant. It's an entrepreneur's job to decide when to fork resources of some kind, which are precious, put them onto something else. I do think two things that came of it that we don't claim any foresight of. One is, well, I guess we were bootstrapped at the time, so we wanted portfolio theory to be on our side. We were very afraid that Jira was successful, but if it fell over, we'd have nothing. And so we wanted 2 or 3 different strings to the bow so that we kind of had some portfolio theory of risk management inside the business. That was part of the thinking at the time. The thing that it did do is made us much better at starting products. Like, one of the things that Atlassian is really good at is actually starting and shipping product. It's really hard to ship products. It's one of the things I know the Dropbox guys struggled with, is they had one product that was like went to the moon, and trying to get that second and third one out of the door a few years later was like, wait, what did we do? How did we do this again? Whereas we do it kind of constantly. Some of them fall over, don't work so well, but like the ability of getting something up and out the door and thinking generically about customers and software and markets rather than getting really into the software development market or whatever was a real advantage for us. Didn't think about it at the time, learning since then.
Explain the paradox of hire slowly against make faster decisions.
Hiring the wrong person will slow you down more than any decision could. It's a good question. Hiring takes a lot of time. It chews up a lot of time in recruiting, it chews up a lot of time, and you've got to believe that every person will add scale, leverage to the organization, right? Making the wrong hiring decision is like adding an anchor to your business. It will slow down that team. The number of times that we've let someone go, and then it sounds like we just fire everybody, by the way. We have a very positive place, but I'm a big believer that there's no bad people. There's just bad people people in bad positions, right? Jobs that aren't right for them at this particular time, as the stories meet. We try to do a great job at Atlassian at celebrating everybody who's added, as we say, one thread to our story, one sentence. It doesn't matter whether you've written a sentence or a chapter, you've contributed somehow to the whole story, and we thank you very much for that. Number of times you let someone go and everyone on the team goes, geez, thank God, that guy was a bozo. And you're like, what the fuck? Why did nobody say that earlier, right? It's like, well, we didn't want to rock the boat, and yeah, but everybody knew that, that guy was an idiot. And you're like, shit. So, and then you ask him later, what happened? Oh, we went way faster without, Fred or whoever it was on board than when he was on board. I'm like, but we haven't refilled the position. It doesn't matter. Fred was like, everyone was having to support Fred and hold him up and do this and that. And Fred wasn't happy, so he was dragging meetings down, whatever. I think it's a really hard paradox. I don't claim any of these things are a unified system of rules to follow. It's tough. It's the hardest thing you can do.
How do you have those hard conversations? How do you fire someone without feeling like the bad guy?
You don't. You will feel like a bad guy. I'll tell you that right now. I have had so many sleepless nights about knowing there's a certain conversation coming the next day. You never know how it's going to go. You have people blow up completely and just walk out in tears. Quite often everybody's crying. It's a hard conversation to sit down with someone and say, it's kind of not working out here. The longer they've been there, the more you know them, if they've been promoted into a job, whatever, lots of reasons why it's really tough. Personal advice, try to be as honest as possible and straight down the line and sort of say, dude, it's not working out, here's why, here's what this is. The one thing that does make you sleep easier, if that conversation is a surprise to that person and I've had plenty in my time where I've been a shitty manager and it's been a surprise to that person, then you're a shitty manager, right? It shouldn't be a surprise to them when you sit them down and say, it's just not working out. If they're like, what? No one's ever told me anything. I thought I was the rock star. It's not their problem. It's yours as a manager, right? So having smaller, tougher conversations on a continual basis makes the big, tough conversations easier. But I'll give you a hint. You will have sleepless nights. It is not an easy thing to do at all. There's no way to make that easy. You got to think about, protecting the people that are in the boat, helping that person. I'll give you two other interesting anecdotes that we've seen repeatedly. One is I've had a whole number of people who got really irate, upset. It's like you're giving someone advice, hey, this isn't working. And they're like, it's a massive personal blow to them. Think about that. Like you walk in one day and then you have a job at the end of it, poof. So they react in all sorts of ways. And I've had quite a number of people now come back 3 or 4 years later and say thank you. Write a nice email, send some sort of a gift and say, I didn't get it when you had a conversation with me. Maybe I went somewhere else, had the same problem, started to learn as a person. Geez, maybe I do this thing that everybody else is seeing me do. You know what I mean? So you're helping them on that journey. It may not seem like it at the time, and not everybody turns around, but it does make a difference to people. The second thing is the individual teams. We make a good job trying to, how do we build it in cultural into the organization to be constantly improving? Having those conversations, right? Because also sometimes it can get so far down the line that it's hard to change somebody, whereas if you have it early, month number 1, hey dude, you're really doing these things that everyone else thinks you're kind of a dick. It's like, oh geez, I didn't know that, sorry, okay, I'll change my behavior. By month 12, everybody just assumes you're a dick. You're a dick now, it's done, right? And you can't change, it's hard. So again, having those early conversations. But we've had a number of teams where teams go, they're like, oh, but that guy was just a great manager, like my boss is gone and they can't do, how are we going to survive? We're never going to hire any better. Make sure you go back to them after you rehire someone 6 months later and say, what are you feeling now? And they'll go, geez, I thought, Fred was good, but Bob is fucking amazing. Now I understand why Fred wasn't good. I didn't realize as a team member what Fred was doing wrong. And now I've seen the way Bob approaches the problem. And again, don't forget, every job is doubling. So it's not a personal slight on these people. It's just a really, really tough thing to do in a company that's scaling that fast. The thing is that having that conversation is not to say, hi, I was right. See, we let go of Fred. Bob was way better. The point is that they learn, I wonder if one of my teams, I'm doing the same thing. And that you want that learning to be constantly cascading down, right? And you want everyone to be feeling like they're growing and they have opportunities to shift and change. It's tough.
This is a good one, favourite question of mine. How does your family life fit with your business life, and what has being a father to 3 young children taught you about being a great CEO, or has it changed anything, or vice versa?
This is another topic you go on for a long time about. Certainly brings things into perspective. Like any parent, I'm sure, you see the world completely differently from day one. Like you're suddenly in a completely different mindset about how you approach problems, and you think teaching people things is really easy, and you're like, fuck dude, I've told you this 10 times. Like, why do you not get that you pick up your pants and you put them in the laundry basket? Like, how hard is it? Like whatever it is. And so you're like, oh geez, maybe it's a learning style thing. And I think you learn about teaching people things. You obviously learn a lot about compassion, right? People go through different journeys and have different difficulties, whether they're employees or children, it's the same. And your job as any form of coach, shepherd of that group of people is to try to help them kind of be the best person they can. And I think you learn that way more when you have kids. I've always said I'm a much better entrepreneur having kids than I was beforehand, because I get all sorts of other problems. You're also a much more tolerant boss, I think. You see how hard it is to juggle, and so when you see people juggle properly, you realise it's pretty amazing, and you try to support them in the workplace environment, in the policies and procedures you have, everything else like that.
What about family life? Obviously, when you started Atlassian, you were the prototypical young man who was working all hours of the night. Obviously, that's not possible now. Talk about what you learnt about productivity, maybe even family life and family life.
No, that's a good point. I think you certainly become a lot more productive as a parent. Got 30 minutes to get out of the house with 3 kids, get them dressed, get them breakfast, make their lunch, da-da-da-da. You're like, all right, I need a plan, I need a repeatable system, like I need to figure out how to do this, and it's just a shit show the first few times, and you kind of figure your way through it, and then you're like, wow, I used to get up and find it hard to put my own pants on. Get a bowl of cereal and get out the door in 30 minutes. Now look what I can do, right? So it certainly changes your productivity goals. I do think it changes your, from the point of view of, the most precious commodity is time. You realise that with kids, both the time you spend with them, but then the time you don't, right? So I've certainly changed my travel patterns quite a lot. I've changed my calendar quite a lot. One of the tricks, it's simple, but I actually block out family time in my calendar. So I take my son to school a couple of mornings a week, and if you book a meeting with me before 9:30, woe betide you, because I ain't turning up, right? It's blocked out in my calendar, and it better be a freaking important meeting, and I mean, there's like 2 of those a year. Otherwise, I'm going to take him to school. And if you don't block out those time, then work will just expand to fill every certain thing, right? So I try to always get home by 6 for dinner, and then you adapt, right? So I have young kids, they go to bed. I try to work from sort of 10 to 12 if I can at night, fill in that gap. Sometimes you're just too tired, you think, I can't do it today, but I think you have to adapt your schedule. But yeah, you try to make every minute count that much more, right? I think it's just what parents do. You realise the finality of life, right? It's a short period you're here, and you want to enjoy that time. It's the same thing as your business. It's a short, you think there's 52 weeks in a year, and then there's only that many days, and you kind of go through it, and you're like, shit, I should do that thing today that I thought I was going to do. Maybe we'll do it one day. Like, you kind of start things a lot quicker, I think.
Ladies and gentlemen, put your hands together.